So we're starting session 6, gender gaps in wages, productivity, and employment. I think I ruined my reputation by running over time, but I'll be very strict with time with the presenters and be a little hypocritical here, but anyways. So the first presenter will be Abou Kane. Thank you. It's 15 minutes. So 15 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Abou Kane.
Sorry about that.
From University Cheikh, Anta Diop, Dakar. And I did this paper with my colleague Mamaye Thiongane. It is about gender wage gap in Senegal, ability differences or discrimination. And we will see. Are you sure that it is the last? It is not the last presentation I sent.
Not the last presentation?
No, no. It's not this one. The one I sent.
We'll get it.
That's good.
These are the new ones. Right here. Yes. Is this the one that you want?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, sorry. I have 10 minutes. Yeah. Okay, so now you have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. Okay, we have overview of the set questions, review, data and methodology and results in discussion. Disparities can be justified by differences in human capital, time allocation, and compensation for more arduous working conditions. But gender disparities in occupational integration and wage persist even when levels of human capital are similar between men and women. And several theoretical explanations have revealed that a portion of this gap is not linked to differences in productive characteristics. And here we will try to know which part of the differences are related to discrimination or abilities. Responsibility for child care and household tasks prevents women wage income from rising faster, and these responsibilities based on social consideration of the roles of men and women affect employment opportunities and discourage women to invest in human capital that the labor market requires. In the labor market, economic discrimination by gender is suspected when equal productive capacities are rewarded differently on the basis of membership of a particular group, men or women. That's why our objective is to examine the sources of gender-based wage disparities in the Senegalese labor market. And the originality of our paper here is related to the fact that we proceed to decomposition beyond the average wage by gender. We also consider the distribution of wage by introducing another methodology. And the research question is, how large is the contribution of discrimination and productive characteristic to wage inequality between men and women. For the literature review, we have human capital theory, Baker's time allocation model, and discrimination theory, neoclassical framework. All these theories tend to show what can be the explanation of differences in wages. But we see that the explanation can be different from one theory to another. For the data and methodology, we use two surveys, one in 2015 and another one in 2021. That are the Senegalese National Employment Survey and the Harmonized Survey on Living Conditions. For the purpose of this paper, the sample includes the population age between 15 and 59 engaged in any activity aimed at producing goods or services in exchange for remuneration. And we exclude self-employment individuals, employers, and family workers, because it is unpaid work. Finally, we have about 60,000 individuals, and 4205 for the second survey. And we use the OHACA blender decomposition approach to identify the proportion of the gap attributable to differences in human capital and the proportion due to differences in reward or similar characteristic. And these differences due in reward for similar characteristics are discriminations. And this method based on non-random sample selection or a sample reduced to worker runs the risk of being biased. That's why we use the Ekman two-stage procedure to determine the probability of a person to participate in the labor market and to calculate the means ratio for each individual. And this means ratio is introduced to the wage equations. We have the mean pay equations with correction of the selection bias, equation 1 and 2. And the third equation is the standard OHACA blender decomposition with a correction of the selectivity. We see that here we can have the effect of productive characteristics, the effect of discrimination, and the selectivity effect. We are interested in the two components, productive characteristics and discrimination. And but the use of average wage decomposition provides only partial information on gender wage gap, and that's why we use an extension of the OHACA blender method, taking into account the distributional approach. We tried to see the 10%, the lowest 10% wage, the upper who the highest 10% wage, and in the medium, the median. That's why we use another methodology from FIRPO 14 and Levy. It is an approach that calculates recentric influence function that allows an analysis of the gender pay gap at different quantiles. And as I said, we have lowest 10%, the median, and the highest 10%. And in a second step, OLS is used to estimate wage equations by replacing the dependent variable by its transformation into recently influence function, and we proceed with the Oaxaca gender decomposition, taking into account this new approach. And we have in equation 5 the new decomposition at different quantiles level. Q is the quantile. It can be the first, the second, third, or so. And here you see that we can have the effect of the productive characteristics at a given quantile. For the results, first of all, we see that the analysis of the average wage levels reveals that men earned almost 39% more than women in paid employment in 2015, and this part is 25% more in 2021. It decreases. In the first survey, differences linked to productive characteristics account for 45%, and those related to discrimination account for 55%. Whereas for the second survey, the component explained by differences in productive characteristics is higher, 60%, and the discrimination is lower. It means that the situation is better than in 2015. The situation for the second survey is better than the one for the first survey. And a simple interpretation of these results is that equal treatment for similar characteristics should make it possible to eliminate 55% of the gender pay gap in 2015 and 40% of this gap in 2021. Because okay, let me continue. Results by explanatory variable for the average wage level. The fact that men are more often heads of household help to justify the advantage, and only the component of differences in characteristics justify a higher wage level for men. For individuals with identical marital status, discrimination in favor of men strongly explains their pay advantage. And in the literature, we see that married women tend to be undervalued because of stereotypes and their exposure to interruption in their activities because of childbearing. The variable age is used as a proxy for potential experience. And even at similar levels of experience, men are better rewarded. Analysis the variable age and its quadratic form allows us to see that women are discriminated against for the first few years of experience, but as they accumulate more, they become progressively better rewarded. For the same level of education, men earn more than women, and the differences in reward for education based on gender. Another result for the wage distribution now, we see that for the lowest 10% of wage distribution, differences in gender characteristics explain 36% of the gap, and discrimination in favor of men account for 64%. For the median of the pay distribution, 46% of this gap is due to differences in productive characteristics compared with 54% due to discrimination. And at the top 10% of the salary distribution, 62% of this gap is explained by differences in characteristics. Differences in valuation for similar characteristics account for 38% of the gender wage gap. we see that we go from a wage gap of 21% in favor of men of the low distribution to a gap of 49% for the median, then to a gap of 10% for upper distribution. These results show that it is in the intermediate pay category that wage disparities are most marked. The other aspect is that the gender pay gap becomes less pronounced when we focus on individuals in the top wage distribution. And in terms of implication, we suggest to have binding rules to combat stereotyping of women that can help or that can make it possible to have equal wage treatment for similar productive capacities. And this regulation should be implemented mainly for jobs offering wage at the lower and intermediate levels of the distribution, where we found the highest gap. And better use of collective agreement with trade union could eradicate gender pay gaps, not linked to difference in productivity. I didn't say that here, but we, in our variables, we have the membership of trade union and all of the variables. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Abou. That was great and on time. Next, Haroon Akram-Lodhi. I'm so sorry, I don't know how to. Discussants. Oh, Discussants, sorry. Jackie, so sorry. I'm messing it up. So, you told me it would help me. You have 7 minutes, sure. Great. Great. Well, good morning, everyone. Oh, it was 10 on the email. That's why I'm saying 7. Well, but practice. It said 10 on the email. That's why I'm kind of converging.
Sorry, yeah.
I'll do it in 7.
Yeah.
Fine.
Now I have 6.5. No, okay, go on.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the excellent paper, Abou. I really enjoyed reading about the gender wage gap in Senegal. I'm just going to reiterate some of your contributions and then talk about some comments and suggestions that might help improve the paper. So the overview was Abou and his co-author are looking at the determinants, and in an earlier paper there was some dynamics as well of the gender wage gap in Senegal. And actually these are the wrong slides too. I'm so sorry. The ones you pulled up before were correct.
Okay.
There was
Oh, come on.
Yeah.
Send me more than one version.
There was a paper change. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the earlier paper I read, but then some of the revisions that I received as well. So looking at decomposition to examine the rules and differences in endowments, and then the returns to the endowments or the coefficient effect. And also using the Furbo et al. Approach to look not just at the average wage gap, but differences across the wage distribution. They use data from 2 different sources in 2 different years, the National Employment Survey in 2015 and the Harmonized Survey on Living Conditions from 2021. I think, and the findings recreated here, plus or minus about half of the gender wage gap is unexplained. And in 2015, that's about 58%, dropping to about 40% in 2021. The contribution in my mind was that Senegal seems like a really interesting case study. In the early version of the paper, they talk a little bit about Senegal and its rank in terms of overall gender equality, fairly low, particularly low when it comes to the subdimension of economic participation and opportunity. But there also seems to be increasing attention and awareness to this issue within Senegal in the second phase of a national strategy for gender equality and equity that was revamped in 2016, I think. Yes. So here are some of my thoughts and comments on ways to kind of grow the paper. The first comment is just some clarification with the data. I am not familiar with the survey, so it could be helpful in the paper to discuss a little bit more about the data, which workers and which wages. You do say that you're looking at anyone earning a wage, but the idea is to compare people that are as similar as possible. So I wonder if that means full-time or part-time, formal or informal. Anyone working for a wage covers a lot of ground. In the US, some of the ways we look at gender wage gaps as apples to apples as possible is maybe annual earnings of full-time year-round workers or usual weekly earnings of full-time workers. So just more information would be helpful there. Defining the explanatory variables. One of the limitations of a Oaxaca blinder is it really depends on the robustness of the variables you include, like the observable characteristics. So I was interested in like what some of these variables mean or how they're defined, like skilled or engaged in training. You might also want to consider including other variables if they're available related to earnings. Like experience, tenure, seniority. I know you say age is kind of a proxy, but I wonder if there's a way to do that better. Occupation and industry. And then crucially, if we're thinking about the constraints that women face in the labor market, number of children or responsibility for caregiving or household tasks. I know that those variables are available in some household surveys. I was also interested in like an overall landscape, like additional descriptive characteristics by gender, which relates to the second point, is kind of a further development or contextualization of results within the Senegal context. I'm particularly interested in like, what do gendered social norms look like in Senegal? For example, some questions like, are women primarily responsible for unpaid household work and care labor in the country? Are they crowded into certain sectors of the labor market because of these gender norms? So for example, they might be excluded from unionized industries, or they might be excluded from unions even if they are engaged in industries that are highly unionized. I would also just use some caution when talking about discrimination. Discrimination can show up in the explained part of the gap as well. I know it's kind of convention in some mainstream literature to call the unexplained portion evidence of discrimination. But discrimination does show up in the explained portion as well. For example, there might be fewer investments in girls' education than boys' education. That has these ripple effects. And then I was interested in like, you know, digging deeper into the size and significance of the endowment effects and coefficient effects to really inform some of your policy implications. In an earlier paper, I was interested in the fact that both the endowment and coefficient effects on married, they didn't change at all over time, and they were like really highly statistically significant. So that's really interesting to me, which leads to this last point is like, what kind of policies best fit or fall out of your findings? For example, you talk a lot about capacity building initiatives for women, but again, I would caution that focusing just on individual attributes ignores like the broader social context in which, like by which women are constrained, especially, you know, depending on the patriarchal nature of the society. So thinking about things that might alleviate constraints women face, access to education, family planning resources, childcare. How are those informed by your findings and what specific policies might fall out of that? But overall, a really interesting and important paper. Thank you so much.
Oh, yes.
Just to reaffirm that we have 15 minutes for presenters and 10 minutes for discussants.
Oh,
So I
okay.
know that
Like that. And
yeah, 10 minutes.
Yeah,
Right.
okay, I'm sorry, I cut 3 minutes off, Jackie, but
So
let's see.
people who have not allocated that, we can't go back in time, but we should at least be fair to the ones who are presenting afterwards. And then, so
Okay, so now, thank you.
But if you're a discussant and a presenter, surely you should be able to reallocate between them.
Exactly.
we-
Okay.
no.
Okay.
Okay.
Right, well, first of all, I want to, of course, say what a personal pleasure it is for me to be back here at Levy, first time in 22 years, and to see so many old friends. The last time I was here, I talked about gender and fiscal policy in Vietnam. But my talk today is very different based upon research that I've been doing since 2017 for UN Women and the World Food Programme. It's the subject of the book for which I had a 0 draft. I'm still working on it. Second, I want to apologize for a couple of things. The first thing is my paper is completely different from everything we've seen because it's feminist political economy and the technicalities, there are technicalities, they're all in the background. I don't put them up front at all. But the second apology is this silly title, the use of the Latin in the title. When I was an undergraduate, which was a long time ago, many of the people that I really admired inserted Latin titles into the Latin phrases into the titles of their paper. So I thought I'd give it a try. But I can't even pronounce this. So that really makes it pretentious. But what it means is when continuities are taken for spaces. But I'm going to change it. I like to name my papers after songs or lyrics from songs, and I'm going to go back to that. So with these caveats in mind, I want to start with something that's really not so well known outside my area, which is critical agrarian studies. And that is Henry Bernstein's 4 questions of agrarian political economy. So his 4 questions are who owns what, who does what, who gets what, and what do they do with it? So who owns what is concerned with the distribution of assets, who does what is concerned with the distribution of work and non-work, who gets what is concerned with the distribution of the social product of that work and the incomes that are generated, and what do they do with it is concerned with how the social product is used, and particularly whether it's used for consumption or whether it's used for investment. Now, I found this framework for students especially to be a very powerful, simple but not simplistic way of trying to understand economic processes, particularly for non-economists. I was very pleased a couple of years ago, I gave a seminar similar to this where I did my PhD at the University of Manitoba, and it turned out that one of the faculty members was teaching her second-year development economics using the framework that I'd introduced her to because she hadn't heard from it before. So I think it's quite a useful framework. Now, from my point of view, it's anecdotally self-evident that who owns what is gendered, who does what is gendered, who gets what is gendered, and what they do with it is gendered. So in this paper, what I try and do is take these 4 questions and then reframe it through elements of social reproduction theory. So social reproduction can be defined as all the work, unpaid and paid, and the sociocultural practices, institutions, and sectors that are essential for the regeneration of both life and capitalist relations. This is from the excellent recent textbook by Sarah Cantillion-Odimacket and Sarah Stavano. And within social reproduction, I focus upon one element, and that's the unpaid care and domestic work of reproductive labor. Reproductive labor produces and maintains the labor force within the household and is a logical and temporal precondition of any labor in productive activities. So how can the interspecies between production and reproduction be captured, both theoretically and empirically? And one way that I have always liked to capture these interstices is Janet Size's bargaining approach to intra-household gender relations, which she published in the Review of Radical Political Economics in 1991. Now, Size's bargaining approach is not bargaining theory. It claims that collective household decisions are the result of a process of explicit and implicit negotiation among individuals within a household. And these negotiations express and reflect a degree of constrained self-interest in the choices of individuals, but are in turn shaped by socially constructed norms and values as well as the structurally based material position of people within households. And this is why I like it, because the structural position of individuals within households shape and are shaped by social norms and values. So size argues that the main objects of bargaining are the division of labor among various tasks, the division of time between labor and non-labor, and the distribution of goods and services to be consumed in order to reproduce the household. But this process of bargaining is shaped by structural factors in the home. Access to non-wage income or wealth among those who are undertaking the bargaining, access to wage income amongst those undertaking the bargaining, and access to formal or informal social support networks among those undertaking the bargaining. Now this, to me, is strongly materialistic. The cooperative and conflictual bargains which govern gender relations within the household are most fundamentally about the capacity to control labor and other resources. And in this way, gender inequalities express patriarchal relations of power, but there are structural foundations to these patriarchal power relations, and that is the control of labor. And I think as an economist, that's where I come in. So what I do in the paper is to use data from Malawi in order to attempt to incorporate a size-flavored bargaining perspective into Bernstein's 4 questions. So in 2015, econometric estimates from Malawi's 3rd integrated household survey demonstrated that in small-scale farming, women who managed plots of land were 28% less productive per hectare than men who managed plots of land. Now, these are not estimates of women-headed households and men-headed households, because those concepts are flaws. The survey asked questions about who principally manages farmland on jointly managed farms, as well as in households which are headed by men and by women. So the data set is much bigger and is much richer. With a gender yield gap of 28% favoring men that manage plots of land, if women land managers were able to simply increase their productivity to that of men, GDP would be estimated to rise by more than $100 million a year, and 240,000 people would be lifted out of poverty every year for 10 years. Next, we go back to something that was just mentioned, but we also go back to something that was mentioned yesterday. A Catawba, Oaxaca blinder decomposition. Jackie, why'd you take Catawba out of that? You've got to acknowledge Catawba, which is usually used to estimate the drivers of gender wage gaps, as we saw for Senegal. We use this to derive from the data why women land managers of plots of land were less productive. And what we see in a decomposition is that women plot operators had lower levels of men's family labor to assist them on their plots of land, that men plot operators produced higher value crops, and that men plot operators had better agricultural technologies, including tools and implements, chemical fertilizers and pesticides, than women plot operators. And all of those results are statistically significant. But statistical significance doesn't necessarily produce results which are economically important. And indeed, statistically significant results might not even be plausible, because econometric correlations can only be based on the data in the data set, which is a function of the questions that are asked. And so if an important question is not asked, it won't show up in the data. And so you don't really know what's going on if you simply rely upon the data. So while the statistical analysis gave causes of women managers of plot land lesser productivity, it was unable to reveal the causes of this. Why were women using lesser levels of men's labor? Why were men producing higher value crops? Why did men have better agricultural technologies? And so in 2017, I was given the task of finding out So I spent 6 weeks in rural Malawi doing field work. Spread across the districts of Mazimba, which is in the far north, Salima, which is in the center of the country, and Nasanja, which is in the south, each of which represented a different agroecological zone. Across all 9 villages, women said exactly the same thing. Women's responsibilities to provide unpaid care and domestic work, reproductive labor, in the home and in the community, reduced their agricultural productivity. Women said that unpaid care and domestic work could require between 5 to 7 hours of work or more a day for an individual. Now, because labor is the main input other than land into Malawian farm production, allocating time to unpaid care and domestic work in the home reduces the amount of time you can spend working on plots of land. So with less time to work on their land, their productivity was less. So reproductive labor clearly structured the terms and conditions by which women became available for the labor of production. In addition to women's responsibilities to provide unpaid care and domestic work, there were 2 other key drivers. The first one, gender-based violence, which again reduced the amount of time that wives could spend on their plots of land. Gender-based violence was also used by some husbands to seize control of their wives' cash and crop resources, in a sense, stealing. And gender-based violence has economic consequences which we don't really talk about. It reduces the labor supply because if you're severely injured, you can't work. If your husband is going to steal from you, why would you save, right? You wouldn't save anything. And if you don't save, you're not going to invest. And you're not going to invest anyway because your husband can steal from you. And finally, because of gender-based violence and because of stealing between husbands and wives, there's a need to increase casual waged labor and petty trading to earn the money that you need to meet household needs. And that also would reduce the amount of time that you had to work on land. And then finally, women had responsibilities to provide unpaid contributing farm labor on plots of land, principally managed by their husbands. And that further reduced the time that they could devote to their plots. And again, because labor is a principal input into production, this impacts upon gender gaps and agricultural productivity. So then the question is, are the quantitative and the qualitative results consistent? And I argue that they are. The first quantitative result was that there were inadequate quantities of men's labor working on plots of land managed by women. Well, in monogamous households, although women worked on joint plots of land, husbands made decisions about crop selection and controlled crop output without equitably sharing the proceeds from crop production. In polygamous households, which were very common, husbands are not willing to work on the plots of lands they assign to their senior wives to produce food for the household. And husbands expect their senior wives to work on their plots of land before anything else is done. So together, what this means is that in monogamous and polygamous households, husbands effectively manage wives' labor. And this allows men to have shorter working days on the farm and focus on their own plots or joint plots because from these they control marketing. The second quantitative result was that men produced higher value crops. Women's social responsibility, however, was to provide food crops for the household. And so their crop selection was a function of social norms. And then the third quantitative result was that men used superior agricultural technologies, but women didn't have the cash incomes needed to buy the better technologies because they have responsibilities to use any cash they have to meet household needs. So the three quantitative findings reflect social norms and values that generate the expectation that the meeting of household needs is the first and foremost responsibility of women. And it's these social norms and values that result in a gender biased distribution of unpaid care and domestic work, which, along with the expectation that senior wives work on their husbands' plots or produce male-controlled cash crops, produces the time poverty amongst women, which reduces their agricultural productivity. I've got a little bit more I was going to say, but my time is up, so I will not. I will leave it.
That's great as a chair. So Tom, Matterson, please, your comments. You have 10 minutes, I guess, but 7 if you want to be fair to Jackie.
Whatever, we'll see how long I take. So I'll just start off by saying that I love reading Haroon's paper late last night. As I joked, as I was telling the truth last night to Haroon at dinner. And it was kind of like coming home for me since Carmen Diana here was my thesis advisor. And so one of my papers was all about women's land rights and management and crop productivity. So it was great to read this. So more, please. So some of the points in no particular order I came up with was I was wondering who the audience for this paper was.
The Latvians.
The point, you know, you talked about in the first section and the second section about, you know, the points you make are, you know, certainly nothing anybody in this room is going to argue with at all. Something you had me at below. And so I particularly wrote, you know, I can't repeat this this comment I made next to this quote that I'll read. But you said, following the 1979 oil price shock, Malawi, with the support of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, sought to introduce market promoting economic reforms. And I just, you know, that shocked me. Like, support is doing so much work there, and not all of it honest, I would say. But you know, it seems like a very mild statement to me. But anyway, so that's one thing that the audience, like, you know, you don't need to convince me that this is a good idea, but maybe you need to convince other people. So. So justifying doing the empirical work in support of the approach seems unnecessary to me. It's kind of you know, kind of related to the first point. In the there's a section that you didn't talk about in your presentation on the agrarian change in Malawi. I would have been interested in hearing more about whether, you know, to the degree to which there was any peasant differentiation over the period since independence. It wasn't really brought out much in the paper. You know, thinking of the peasantization, depeasantization debate, and you know, so maybe that's just me. I like that stuff. A minor question I had, at one point you said that 82% of women and 18% of men engage in unpaid household production work. And I wondered if that was the share that they did of household production work. It seemed weird that it added up to 100%. I don't know. It could, right? It could just be a coincidence. Again, major points for referencing Kingawa, the decomposition. I'd shared the dismay that Kitagawa would disappear from the second version of Jackie's comments. One thing in the paper you don't talk about this, but the conditional versus the unconditional gender gap. It wasn't entirely clear how you constructed the conditional gender gap. And like you said, the technicalities weren't upfront in the paper. So that's something I reacted to since I'm a stickler for tech. So what can I say? I guess I just want to wrap up. This is an absolutely crystal clear argument for the use of qualitative methods to supplement quantitative methods. You know, it's so good. It's great. I was so jealous of having that. You know, I would have loved to have even the quantitative data you had from Paraguay when I was writing my dissertation, but I didn't anyway. But especially the incorporation of the economic impact of gender-based violence in this case, you often see that kind of studied separately from economic impacts. It was so good to see that in this paper. So wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now we have Mina Baliamoune-Lutz. I'm not sure. That's not it or not.
Okay, perfect. Okay, I think the announcement that I was made about the time was to 100.
Yeah, sorry. Always.
So anyway, I start by thanking the Levy Institute and the team for inviting me, although this is not my first time to the workshop.
No,
This is my first time here now.
yes.
Yeah, previous ones were in New York City. Okay, so my paper is simple, right? So I use macroeconomic data, so you cannot, if you have any complaints about the data, we have ILO here and the World Bank, so you can mention that, that's the data I use. I look at the effects of trade openness on gender labor market, on women's labor market outcomes. I use men in one of the specifications also. And I do that really just looking at trade openness itself as my variable of interest, and a few other variables that have been widely used, like fertility, income, and so on. And why do I do this? Well, I don't know how many of you know the MENA region, but there is this particular thing about women in the MENA region in the labor market. There is a very, very low labor force participation. So it's like it's stuck at that 20% in neighborhood for years, and I'm going to show you the graph. And it has been persistent, which is really a problem, even though the region has achieved good levels in education and health for women. And that led the World Bank a few years ago to labeling this as the MENA gender equality paradox. Okay, and you'll find that in some pictures. It is also very relevant to the SDGs. The one about gender, of course, SDG 5, then SDG 8, especially in its target 8.5, which says that by 2030, which means roughly in about 5-6 years, we need to achieve full and productive employment, and this is for all men and women. And then for SDG 17, which has targets that deal with boosting international trade and especially expanding exports from developing countries. So it's like the point of intersection between gender equality and international trade is very important. And for the MENA region, it seems like many of those countries cannot achieve both at the same time. Also because there is a gap in the literature. Now you find lots of studies that have been done, especially some Asian countries, but Latin American countries, Brazil and Mexico in particular. But they're all based on microdata. And the ones that were done in sub-Saharan African countries, mostly few on Egypt and Morocco, not really much. They're all microdata, either looking at industries or workers. And there is nothing on macro. And I'm a macroeconomist, and it shows macroeconomics because even though micro is important, I think macro links more to policies, which always makes me think policies. As a policymaker, you want to see what's doing to the country. And so that's why. This is the female labor force participation. And of course, as you can see, the Middle East and North Africa has the lowest. And it has been, as I said, hovering around that neighborhood of 20%. This, of course, the dip here is due to COVID for everybody. It's interesting that sub-Saharan Africa has the highest female labor force participation, but if you know a lot about not a lot, if you know this about sub-Saharan Africa, female tend to work in the informal sector and necessity entrepreneurship, which really means that they're good. Latin America does better in that sense, but you also have South Asia that's doing not so good. But the MENA is the worst. MENA region is the worst. At the same time, if you look at trade openness, and trade openness here is very simple, just the volume of trade, imports plus exports as a percentage of GDP. Unfortunately, data for the whole of sub-Saharan Africa didn't exist in these years, at least the World Bank does it. So you have to sit down and actually calculate it. And since I was just added this at the last minute, just sub-Saharan Africa here, I just took the data from the World Bank. So as you can see, this is the MENA region. You see that over here, on average, the MENA region does much better than the other regions in trade openness. Okay, this is as a percentage of GDP. So they're very open economies when it comes to this, using this indicator. And that's important because if we find bad effects from trade liberalization or trade openness on women, and these countries are gonna keep being open like that, then something has to happen. So some policy actions have to take place to reverse the negative effects on women. And then in this graph, I have the labor force participation by male and female, and I use the ages from 15 to 64. And I'm actually thinking about taking out youth, the youth, which is 15 to 24, out of this, and then just looking at anybody, you know, age 25 and above. But the point here is that, so the blue here, the first blue is for the MENA region, and this is 1991 and then 2022, just to see that things really didn't change much. And as you can see, when it comes to male, the MENA region is not very different from the rest. Female, however, it's huge difference, okay? And that's years ago. 2022, same story. So there is something that's not changing, and it cannot be just social norms, because social norms, thanks to Facebook and all these things together and stuff, are changing. And I mean, I visit Morocco and you see there is huge change. Morocco, Egypt, you know, complete difference. This generation has nothing to do with their mothers and grandmothers' generation. And so it cannot be, we can only blame so much on social norms and religion and these things, really. So it has to be some economic things that are not working. Anyway, so, and then I look at wage employment. This is wage and salaried workers. That's data is published by the ILO. Unfortunately, the ILO used to publish data on the share of women in the wage employment in the non-agricultural sector. And then they stopped doing that. I like that data better. Yeah, they don't publish that anymore. So now this is different thing. So this is just, we're looking at women that are employed, in percentage, how many of them are in wage employment, and same thing for men. So it doesn't give you this, we can extract from it, you know, notion of inequality, gender inequality, but it's not the same thing as looking at the share of women in total wage employment in the country. But at any rate, we can see that for wage employment, actually, the male and female in the MENA region are comparable. So the difference is not huge. Same thing here. In fact, the percentage of women in wage employment in recent years is higher. So now here is the story. We have a small portion of women working actually in the labor force. And when they work, a huge portion of that, which is about 70+%, work in wage employment because they're looking for security, for social protection, and lots of those jobs are in the public sector. Okay, so that's the story. It's a huge deal in places like Egypt and Morocco. Two questions, but first one is the main one, really. Do the effects of trade on women's labor market outcomes help us understand why we have this gender paradox in those countries? And when I compare to Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, because of that high labor force participation, would I be able to use that to explain the gender paradox and why the region is different? And then are the effects of other factors, maybe fertility and education, are not working the same way that we have? Okay, so just in case Luiza tells me to stop, I'm going to talk about the results now. Okay, takeaways are, I find that the effects of trade openness on female labor force participation and wage employment in the MENA region, for the most part, have a negative effect. And they're different from what I find for Latin America as a region, for Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. So Latin America and the Caribbean countries. I use 17 countries, and I'm going to show you from the MENA, 16 from LAC, and more than that from Sub-Saharan Africa. Then the second thing is the effects of the other factors are also different across the regions. You don't see the same effects. And the results suggest that there is significant hysteresis in labor force participation, also in wage employment, but more importantly in labor force participation. And that we don't need to test it because from the graphs and from the numbers we can see. And that hysteresis is a problem because whenever we have that in labor markets, it means you can come up with beautiful policies and they're not going to work unless you find the reason why you have the hysteresis itself and why that started it. Okay. So, as I said earlier, the empirical literature on this topic is mostly based on micro level data. The evidence, even for the same country, like if you pick the studies that looked at Brazil or Mexico, For the same countries, you're gonna find mixed results. Like some people find positive effects, others find negative effects, others say ambiguous effects. There is a nice review that was done by Pires and co-authors that's published in the Journal of Development Studies. And that review came with the conclusion that trade had a positive effect on women's employment in the unskilled manufacturing sector, but also led to a gap, the widening of the gap in wage employment. So even when trade increases female employment, they are pushed in the unskilled labor, so they end up making a lot less or being really poorer when men move on to the skilled labor jobs. Thank you. Okay, so I already talked about Brazil and Mexico, and the only macro things, and this is why I said there are two things. First of all, there is this working paper at the World Bank that was done recently that concluded that trade had reduced informality in Morocco, but may have decreased women's participation in the labor force. And this is very important because they looked at industries and they said it happened because as Morocco opened even further, they moved away, they got rid of pretty much all the textile business there, industries, moved away from the female labor-intensive industries to male labor-intensive industries, making automobiles and things like that. And that's new. So this is continuing, meaning instead of fixing the problem, they are making it worse. Yeah. Okay, the data, as I said, is data from across countries for the period 1991 to 2019. And this is the number of countries I use. And I use a simple thing. I just use, I have a kind of time series and across countries. So I use the Arellano bond dynamic GMM estimate. Okay, so instead of going over this, since I don't have time, I will summarize this, but the paper is in the program. So I find that, as I said, for the most part, there is a U relationship between trade openness and I know we don't like the squares and stuff, but I work with that. U relationship between trade openness and female labor force participation, and also I find similar with the wage. The problem is that before it starts, the effect starts getting positive, you have to reach an openness level of 94 to 98%, which is higher than around 80% of the median and the mean, which means many countries are still in that negative effect area. And the results are different from what I find in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. I don't find really effects there that are negative on women. But also I find that education, so I in some specifications, I use secondary educations, in other education, in others, I use tertiary education just to see the effect. So in the MENA region, there is a positive effect of tertiary education on female labor force participation. So women who have tertiary education, they actually want to be in the labor force, but many of these women are lawyers, doctors, and things like that. But it doesn't have an effect on wage employment. So if they're in the liberal professions, they own their own practice or something, they're not considered as wage employment. Secondary education, on the other hand, does have a positive effect on wage employment for women. If I control for the role of tertiary education, then I find the effect of fertility being on labor force participation being negative in the MENA region, which is expected. And I don't find support for the feminization U in the sense that income, I tried this, it's not in, I didn't report everything in the paper because it would be too many tables, but I tried the square and it didn't work. And even the effect of income is not robust. So pretty much most of the countries are not even, the income is not linked to the labor market in that sense. Okay, thank you. One thing that we use, and that's why I was asking Luiza about what type of infrastructure, I use electricity. Because data on roads for like many countries, it's no longer there, right? And it's, it's patchy. So I use electricity because we do have access to electricity in urban areas, rural areas, and total that the World Bank publishes. And I use that because electricity can allow, if there is access to electricity, then women can use home appliances, right? And things like that. So it frees up time for women. And then they supposedly will go to the labor force, right? There is no significant effect in MENA regions. Positive effect only in Latin American countries and ambiguous effect in Sub-Saharan Africa. And then that's on the labor force, and then I don't find a significant effect on wage employment. So for policy implications, I know that many papers really did beautiful things about policy implications here, so some of those really apply to this case also. But at least in the non-oil exporting MENA countries, for example, Morocco, because it doesn't export oil, to investigate how some things that we haven't studied in the literature or have been understudied might have contributed to preventing the labor force participation for women from going up as income goes up, because this country is really there. If you look at the per capita income, it has gone up over time in real terms. Then finding this, maybe the EU relationship with trade may help us understand what's going on, that the countries get richer, but they're moving towards things that benefit men more in terms of labor markets than women. Okay, but I just wanted to say one last thing about, or show you the graph about the persistence. I just said that really we can only blame so much on culture, social things, and customs and things like that. This is for youth, right? Youth. These are people between ages between 15 and 24. And as you can see, the same story continues. And if it continues, then it cannot be just social norms. I'm sorry, because the same story here. So you have male, this is total actually. Male is even worse because it's going to be higher. This is female labor force participation compared to total. And you see how low it is. And if it were male, it would be like up here. And then for unemployment, you can see that the unemployment for female and male, this is female, I don't know which are in dark blue, but this is youth female. And this is this is also unemployment total. You can see that again for female it's much higher, while in the other regions it's not like that. So the story continues and it's persistent, and I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So now for discussing that same molecule.
No, it's not. I know. But you want me to put it back?
Thanks, Mina. Very good afternoon to everyone. We've just hit 12. So I'm going to discuss her paper on why the MENA region is different from the rest of the sectors in the region that she spoke of, and also what should policymakers do. And I think it's a problem statement that she has outlined. But I think this is a very important discussion, because when we look at the complex issue of the effects of trade, we very rarely look at, as the literature review that she has cited, look at the effects from a gender perspective. And I think that the focus, particularly on these nations, which are more the emerging and the developing regions, is also quite important in the comparisons that she actually does, so that you don't just look at the MENA countries, but you also look at Latin America and the Caribbean, but also Sub-Saharan Africa. So she has quite an extensive data set to look at and to make valid remarks in terms of the comparisons. I think also the differentiated effect using the variables of interest are quite important, because the specific focus rather than unemployment rate is also to look at the extent to which wage and salaried female workers are in the labor market, but also the labor force participation rate, looking at both, but the female proportion is obviously the focus and the area of interest. I think that extensive literature review has been pointed out as the paper shows the gap is quite significant, and I think the contribution that this paper will make in terms of just the discourse and showing the gender effect is quite important. And for me, reading it is definitely has been a real honor, looking at the work that Mina has done, but also extensively. I think this contribution is quite important, because trade policy is an important aspect for just general economic growth. And it's punted as one of the main drivers for so-called economic growth and economic outcomes within the discourse of economic strategies in countries. And if we don't look at trade policy and its effect, and what the unintended consequences are from a gender perspective, I think that we're missing a crucial and important aspect in terms of looking at some of these development outcomes. So I think this paper is very important, and I think that the effect of trade openness alone and its outcome, I think the results are that it widens the gender gap and that it reduces women's wage employment, specifically in the MENA countries. The results are different from the Sub-Saharan Africa. In Sub-Saharan Africa, it has an inverted effect, and then I think the other area is non-significant. So I think one has to then look deeper at what are the drivers for this, but also how can this be dealt with. So my feedback, I'm not an expert on the GMM Arenalo bond, I think methodology, but I think one of the things that I thought could be interesting to look at from the perspective of the why. I think the problematization that Mina talks to as there have to be other reasons as to why outside of social norms that could be the reason driving why MENA countries particularly have this phenomenon. In the introduction, perhaps look at the size of the different sectors, the sectoral contributions of the capital-intensive sectors, the labor-intensive sectors, particularly services and agriculture, because they both have different patterns in terms of employment patterns and the trends within the services sector. It's not clear to the extent to which all of these regions, what's happening underneath these subsectors, whether the capital or the labor-intensive sectors. The informality, I think, Sub-Saharan Africa differs mainly from MENA. I know that informality is much higher in Sub-Saharan Africa than it would be in the Middle East, North African countries. But to what extent does this play a role? And the vulnerabilities then with women in all these three different sectors, though they have the lowest labor force participation rate, you find that they have a higher proportion within the more formalized sectors of the economy, and that may also have a result in the outcomes. I think other important determinants and variables that could be of interest are the use of the different measures of trade openness. So I picked up that she uses the real trade openness definition of imports and exports in relation to GDP. But there's a paper that I found by Gosgo that looks at different measures. They look at economic globalization index, they look at the COP index, which looks at the political economy and the political dimension of globalization. And also you can look at the nominal measure for this, but nominal measures we know are biased. So it may be more useful to look at these other indices that look at the political economy and the political dimension, which would be the COP and the economic globalization index. Do they give the same results in terms of the impact on trade openness on these two variables of interest that we're looking at, which is the labor force participation rate and also the wage employment as a share. So I think that particularly females. So I've got a little bit of time, and I think my last is more on the post-estimation test that you could do, consider maybe some different variables that look at the effect, particularly monetary policy. I thought that would be interesting. If you look at trade policy, my thinking was that if you look at things like the exchange rate, inflation, interest rate, probably they would maybe tell you a little bit more of a story in terms of the post-estimation. Having looked at, I know that on the right-hand side, you have those variables of interest on income and the others. The informality, I've also added the informal market, the size. And then I think two factors that I think are very critical. The gender equity framework. I know that you didn't speak to this in your introduction or in the background, but is it the same what's happening in Middle East, North African countries from a gender equality perspective, from the legal frameworks? Are those countries indices from inclusion, the legalities, the laws, the frameworks more open versus Sub-Saharan Africa than the others? Because it may not just be social norms, but the laws, in fact, are a hindrance. And I think that the issue of trade subsidies, are there trade subsidies and trade subsidies specifically in some of these subsectors that enable perhaps different outcomes? And trade subsidies usually, I think, from the fiscal perspective, you would see a share of that allocated, to some measure towards opening up trade, but does that have an offsetting outcome in terms of the outcomes for the participation? So for example, if there was a trade subsidy in agriculture and more women are in agriculture, would trade openness have a positive or negative effect in the long run within those subsectors? I'm not really sure what the outcomes would be, but it would depend on what the transmission effect is directly on women in the different subsector. It may be that they have subsidies in other subsectors to women that are specific, and that maybe could be a variable of interest that you could add just to make it interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'd like to call the presenters to join me here at the table, and we can, I guess, start with adding questions to the comments so that they can respond to those together as we've been doing. Okay, I'm not gonna start, let's start with EPAC, because there are no. We can start with EPAC there. I never give the first question to a man, I'm sorry about that. But then we can go, yeah.
Yeah, this is a comment and a question for Mina on the analysis on the MENA region. The trade openness being so high for the MENA region has a lot to do with oil exporting. Okay, then a question for you to comment on, whether combining oil exporting countries and non-oil exporting countries as a lump in the same analysis, particularly when we look at women's labor force participation impact, makes sense, because there's some brilliant analysis, as I'm sure you're aware of, by Valentine Mogadam, which situates a historical analysis of women's labor force participation in the MENA region as a case of the curse of natural resources, through which the MENA had nothing to do with social norms, but rather a very material basis of the development of capitalism in that region through the, based on oil exports, increasing GDP per capita, high household incomes, having implications, negative implications for improving women's labor force participation in the region, both on the demand side by preventing the economies going through a structural transformation and limiting jobs generation and limiting wage employment, and also on the supply side through oil earnings that come through the male ownership. That also reflects through remittances in the non-oil exporting but Arabic speaking countries in the region. So how would you sort of flesh out the various impact of these combined factors?
Thank you, Beck. I have Mark, oh my God, there's so many questions. So I'm gonna ask everyone to really be very quick with the questions. Go ahead. Okay, I'll go with Indira because she also raised it very quickly.
My question is to Mina. Basically, the impact of trade on the economy depends on at what point the country is globalizing the value chain. If at a lower level, and that happens in many countries where education is low, fertility is high, and then when informal sector is predominant, etc., then obviously women will be joining at the lower end of the value chain and will suffer. I mean, they will have low wages and so on and so forth. But if you have better situation, if your economy is in a better position, capital intensive industries and all that, and education of women is high, then you join at a higher level. Because in the given global market structure, the bargaining with these countries is a little less. The others are more powerful, with the first world or whatever developed countries, industrialized countries. And that's why this basic bargaining is very important in determining the where you join in value chain and the impact.
Thank you. Do I have a question not for Mina? We can have obviously she can have the questions, but there are too many questions. I need a criteria. Go ahead.
Really enjoyed the paper, and you mentioned unpaid care work in domestic chores is the #1 reason for the gender gap. I was wondering, what about women's mobility? Do women have access to agricultural extension services, getting their produce to the market? My second point is about preferences. So if we were to equalize bargaining power and access to imports, would this mean that women would increase agricultural productivity, or would they prefer to work in non-farm work instead? And then the third point is about climate variability, because Malawi is susceptible to drought and flood, and how male and female responses to this climate shocks might vary in terms of adoption of climate-resistant varieties and agricultural practices, and how much that contributes to this gap. Yeah, twice.
Okay, another question for Haroon. Okay, Marcella here.
You speak about gender-based violence. Oh, yeah. Okay, it's again the boys. You speak about gender-based violence, but actually all the examples that you have given are more economic violence. So is it correct to speak about economic violence in the context of your analysis?
Do I have a question for Abou? Okay, over there now. In the back.
Abou, what were your control variables? Haroon, what did you not get to say that you wanted to say? And Mina, I don't know development, so I looked up Mina and found out what that meant. But I looked up lack and I couldn't find it, and it wasn't defined until your discussant wrote it out. But it is a resinous substance produced by insects, so just in the future, if we can.
It is in the paper.
Okay.
Go ahead, please, yeah.
I'll try to be quick. Thank you. This is for Haroon. I'm a sociologist. I heard the name Janet says, and I was very excited because that also formed part of my background, and I thought structure action theories, and yeah, great potential there. In my opinion, the structure action theories and their importance is in understanding processes of change and the articulation of the different levels of the theoretical model in promoting and the possibilities for the creation of change. So I just wondered, because you didn't really come back to, that sort of articulation between the structure and action, the household bargaining, and whether there are indeed any processes of change at any level of that model that you saw.
Valeria?
For me. Okay. The role of public employment in these countries, which I've understood, at least for Egypt, for example, that is really the driver of wage employment. There is nowhere to be seen, or at least you didn't mention it. So.
Okay, I have anyone else there, and then all the way in the back. Let's go all the way in the back, and then here, and then we'll let them answer.
Okay.
It's been a while.
We have 3 questions from online. Did you see any migration trends in the communities you studied? Haroon, given the results you obtained, what are the policy implications derived? In other words, what can be done to improve women's conditions in that context? And I would like to know whether in the quantitative approach to studying the gender gap in agricultural productivity, variables that have been included to capture time use differences between men and women, or any variable that reflects the disproportionate burden on women from unpaid domestic.
There.
My question to Abou about your research literature, I didn't see it, but maybe you heard about work done by Delaney Goanawarta on case of Sri Lanka. on the gender wage gap, reducing gender wage gap, exactly the same analysis. It would be very useful to look at. It's not a question, just.
Okay, I'll add one for Abou as well. I was just curious, you mentioned the role of trade unions, and in some countries we've observed actually trade unions working the other way around, kind of benefiting men and not necessarily the equality of wages. I was just curious, in the case of Senegal, how does that work? And now I'll pass the microphone for you all to answer. I'll do it in the same order as before, so you can start. Abou, we have, say, 3 minutes each.
Okay. Thank you to Jackie for your comments. I took notes for one of your questions on if it is full time or not. We just take all the workers that are paid, even if it is not full time. Okay, and for the other aspect, I think you have given some suggestions and we will take it into account. For the trade unions, I just want to precise that we are not saying that women are excluded from trade unions, but the leaders of trade unions are mainly men. Women are excluded from leading trading. That's the point, not leading from. And for the control variables, you know, if we compare men to women, we know that there are some endowments that are different. If you take the statistic, the descriptive statistics, you can see that men are mostly in higher, higher level of the wage distribution because they have abilities or human capital that women does not have. That's why in our control variables we take into account the residence, the zone of the residence, because we have in some rural areas we know that women don't have access to education. That's why we control of this. This is the only control variable we use in the analysis. I don't know who asked this question. Yeah, it is. For Sri Lanka, I don't know, but I will be happy to read it to see how we can use the results of some other point developed in this paper. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, I've got a fair number of questions here, but I'm going to try and group some of them together. Let's start with let's go back to Janet's eye, structure and agency, but I'll look at that in terms of also, does bargaining power improve if productivity is going to be equalized, and also Tom's comment about differentiation. And I'll answer that with an anecdote, which maybe isn't the right thing to do, but because not from Malawi, but I was 2 weeks ago I was doing field work in Tharaka, Nithi, and Isiolo in Kenya, and in Isiolo, which is northeast of Nairobi, a couple of the men that I talked to said something which was very interesting. And that is that, that the language of women's economic empowerment had been passed down to these communities through various interventions of development organizations, both UN ones as well as NGOs. And the men said they didn't want women's incomes to improve because this would increase their autonomy. And it was important to them, therefore, to ensure that they controlled income flows. Now, what that says to me again is this whole approach over the control of labor, that by denying women gains in productivity, that you are actually able to maintain your patriarchal power, and therefore the men manipulate structures to their advantage, in a sense to diminish the agency of the possible agency that women would get if their bargaining power improved. And in terms of in these sorts of terms, it is interesting that in terms of differentiation, that there are some quite marked differences in household class locations between those that produce for the market versus those which only sometimes sell on markets. The most notable thing, however, I would say, is that in the better off households, women were materially better off, but I think their status was lower. And the reason their status was lower was, again, that with better incomes, you can more strictly enforce social norms. And so, I mean, I've seen women who our team interviewed who were very well dressed, had fancy phones. Clearly, dietary intake was absolutely fine, and I thought their status was much lower than in some of the poorer communities that I've been to. So that kind of differentiation was there, but also it's really important to talk about gender-based differentiation, which leads me then to Marlene's question, really, what did I not get to say? What I really didn't get to say, which goes back to Tom's very first thing, I didn't know Carmen Diana was your advisor, you were very lucky. That looking at the household as an agent of class relations, it seems to me, is wrong in the sense that you'd have to evaluate the extent to which there is or is not pooling. And if there is significant pooling, then I think individuals and households could share the same class location. But if there is not significant pooling, I think it's much more likely that individuals and households do not share the same class location. And so the household as a unit of class analysis has to be really unpacked, which Carmen Diana said in 1975, and still isn't paid attention to. Do I have 1 minute more? Yeah. Okay, I've got 1 minute more. Migration and mobility. Well, women's mobility is quite restricted, but men do migrate. They migrate from Malawi to into South Africa in search of work. That does improve women's autonomy back in Malawi, because very often when the men migrate, they don't come back. So migration can be beneficial in that sense. Agricultural extension, migration can be beneficial for women because, no, it's a serious point. Because they want to live on their own. And it's society which says get married. And they want to have children, so they get married and they have children. And then they realize they want to be as separate from their husband as possible. Agricultural extension in Malawi, compared to other countries in Eastern and Southern Africa, Malawi's actually got quite a good agricultural extension service, but it's got no money. Absolutely nothing. I mean, agricultural extension services were completely destroyed by structural adjustment. Economic violence versus gender-based violence. Well, yes, the economic consequences are economic violence, but behind them is the use of force. The work that I've just done in just trying to think of the county because everything's jamming together. Yes, in Isiolo, every single village where we went to do research, there'd been a femicide through gender-based violence. So every single one. So that is gender-based violence. I'll leave it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay,
so
I'll give you like 7 minutes because you have so many questions.
Thank you. So I first want to thank Anta for the great comments. Thank you so much. Very, very useful comments. And I start with the first thing, which is about including the different sectors, like looking at different sectors, and also the role of informality. The sectors I can do, and I was actually thinking about that. Informality is more difficult because I can't find like consistent data, time series data on that. Although I might try it just for like one point in time and do cross-section with them. The other variables that might be used as alternative measures of trade openness, yes, that's also a very good point. And I was thinking about looking more at reductions in tariffs. But indicators of globalization are also important. As a matter of fact, my first paper on gender inequality that was published in the Journal of African Economies in 2007 was using globalization, and in that I worked on Africa, and the title was "Is Africa Different?" And so that's, yeah, I will look into that as well. The post-estimation test and looking at the effects of exchange rate policy, for example, is very important. I think for what I'm trying to do, exchange rate policy will be more important than other, like interest rates and other things. Yeah, so that's a very good point. And then the gender equity framework in the MENA countries, it's not the same. Egypt and Morocco are similar in Tunisia, they're very close. The oil producing countries are different, but even the oil producing countries, Qatar and Emirates, are different from Saudi Arabia. And as Haroon was talking, that exactly applies to Saudi Arabia. In fact, there were years ago, people would talk to women there, and women would say, "Why you have very low labor force participation?" And someone would say, "Why do you want us to work? I have 3 maids, I have a driver, I have this and that. If I want to fly to Paris, my husband sends me, I mean, she has to do whatever he says, but she goes. And I get diamonds, I get all these things. I don't want to work. The Moroccan women and the Tunisians should work, but we have oil." And so it was really bad because that's kind of putting women on back. So, but it does happen. But since MBS, just for your benefit, MBS is, what is it, Mohammed something? Bin Salman. So that's the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. Since he pushed for more rights for women, as soon as they added those things and for women to go to work and drive, the labor force went up by 30%. So women, but they're working, mostly like family business and things like that, and government offices. So yeah, but that's something that I cannot do it quantitatively because the indicators are just not like indexes. But I could talk about it, in the very important point. Okay, so the comments, and I think the first one came from IPAC, yes, very good comment, IPAC. What I did is, the problem with doing this type of estimation is that I need a certain number of observations. If I take the oil producing countries out, the MENA, the rest will be too small really to give something meaningful. So I did try it with just dummy variable in oil production interacted with the trade, no effect. In fact, once I do it, nothing really works except for the trade effect itself. So it didn't show for some reason. So I don't know what to do. I'm actually still thinking about that. But just observing the data, knowing what I know about the region, but especially about Morocco, if that's what, if the oil production was a reason for women not to be, kind of adequately represented in the labor force, then Morocco should have much higher labor force participation, and it doesn't, and Morocco doesn't produce oil. So it cannot be just the oil production. In fact, the female labor force participation in those countries is higher than in Morocco and Tunisia and places like that. Why? Because when the ILO gets the data, they do the data, not you, but the ILO, right? The data, they count the people, residents living there, not the Qatari citizens and guess what's happening there? A lot of women from the Philippines, Pakistan, Bangladesh, all the countries, they work there. And so that's counted as female labor force. And so how are you gonna really treat that? Now, do the law regulations that they have, the laws and regulations for labor market that they have there apply to them? Also, yes, to a certain extent. But other laws like only a female can do this or inherit that, or it doesn't apply to them because they're just residents, they're not citizens. And so that's really very delicate thing. So anyway, just to answer Ipak's question. But it's an important point. Remittances are very important. And I was thinking, should they include them or should they not include them? Because North Africa specifically has high influx of remittances. But I'm working on remittances on a separate paper for the ASSA meeting. So I'll see when I get there and see if there are synergies. Indira's point, very important one, that's about the stages of value chain level in countries and the bargaining power of women. That, however, does require more detailed, like micro or industry level data. But again, I might talk about it. I don't find the feminization U, which is the stages of development. Now, the countries in the MENA region, aside from the oil producing countries, the others are all comparable in income. They're middle income countries. Sometimes they jump to upper middle income. Sometimes they fall down to lower, but middle income countries. So they're kind of similar. Education is roughly some comparable levels for women. And so, but I will talk about that. I cannot do it quantitatively.
We have done an empirical study on this. About the joining trade at the different levels of value chain.
Yeah, okay. But for India or for?
Sorry?
You said empirical study.
Yeah.
For which country? For which country?
India.
For India?
No, for several developing countries.
Oh.
Because India is joining at the lower end mostly. Okay. So we are losing a lot, but then there are countries which are in a better position in bargaining and they join at a higher level. Reasons which I said, but ones which can join.
Yeah, but I think there is if we look into this, we're probably going to find a strong link between that and income anyway. So it's kind of, probably it's a proxy for the level of development as well. 10 minutes, I can do that. Maria's question. Oh, yeah, 10 minutes. No, I'm an optimist. I always Anyway, so Maria's question. The role of the public sector, I think I was talking over there, maybe it's just Thomas and Ajit, but I did mention that. And I said when women are kind of a lot into the wage employment because they want the safety and security, and they're mainly in the public sector. So they are in the public sector. But I don't have data, like the data that to include to show how many women in the public sector.
I thought you said that there were professionals in the independent.
That's for the women with tertiary education, when I was saying when they get tertiary education. But when I was looking only at the data for the wage employment, I said a lot of, when I was showing just the graphs, the ratios are nice, they're comparable to Latin America. So I said they go there, women, when they work, the labor force is low, but when women are working, they are in the wage sector, and the wage sector, lots of them, and I even mentioned Egypt. Egypt is known for having lots of women in the public sector. Yes, but very good point. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you. Okay, now lunch a little late.